with you. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And this is a talk I will be giving when I get back to Arkansas, where I curate the zoology collection. So if there's something you like or something you don't like, please feel free. I know some of you will, because I know you, will be happy to tell me exactly what your feelings are about all this. Well, let's see if I can make this all work here. On September 1st, 1914, Martha, the last 29-year-old passenger pigeon living at the Cincinnati Zoo, died at 1 p.m. 100 years earlier in 1814, this species was the most common bird in North America. 100 years later, in 2014, we regret and commemorate her senseless passing. And that essentially is the end of my talk. Goodbye. That's all you need to know, and you will hear lots of this. I'm sure on TV there are some specials coming out, and there are articles in all the magazines. So I'm just going to give you my little idiosyncratic talk about what I thought was interesting. Now, unfortunately, the thing that went wrong here is that for some reason, this slide, which is one of the 2 passenger pigeons that I have in my University of Arkansas collection, doesn't show up, but it's on that disc cover right there. So if you pass that around, you can see what it looks like. And what you would see, if you could see that, is a very large pigeon, about 19 inches long, 1.5 times bigger than a rock dove, the normal pigeon that you see sitting around. And it's very beautiful. The male, which you will see there, has a bluish back, red eyes, and a bright orange breast. It looks like a robin when I show the kids. Okay, they say it's a very large robin, but it isn't. It was a passenger pigeon, and it was gorgeous. Now, you'll see some other pictures, but you can, well, no, that isn't, I can't. We don't know how to go back. This is sort of odd. Okay, well, okay, like the passenger pigeon, I spend my summers in the north and my winters in the south. So my viewpoint will oscillate between Wisconsin and Arkansas. My professional perspective is that of a curator of zoology. I deal with animals that are really dead and they have no behavior. I am committed to maintain my collection and preserve the specimens and tell their story wherever possible. And since the picture that you didn't see was one of my animals, this is his story too. I will tell you a bit about their biology, the history of interactions with people, and attempts possibly to de-extinct the passenger pigeon. And while I'm doing this, I want you to think about Martha, her species, and draw some parallels about the current fates of endangered wildlife. I also want you to listen for references to Wisconsin, because Wisconsin has had a great part in the telling of the story of this and other wildlife adventures, and it's indeed a wonderful state. Well, what kind of bird was the passenger pigeon? We know that it was a member of the order Columbiformes, for you birders. It's characterized by worldwide distribution. They eat fruits and grains, among other items. They're very strong flyers, poor nest builders. They're monogamous and have 2 characteristics are distinct to the Columbiformes. They produce something called crop milk for their young, and they have the ability to drink by sucking. They're not like most birds that have to tip their head back like those little toys that you see. They can just right out of the water. So when we think of pigeon, we usually think, at least I do, about the all too common rock duck, which is indeed not related very closely to passenger pigeons, and this is an invasive species from Europe. Okay? Well, this is what the passenger pigeon was most closely related to. This is the dodo bird, a large, flightless, and unfortunately very tasty pigeon, native to Mauritius, which became extinct in the mid-1600s. They were not necessarily dumb, as the saying goes, but they were flightless, which is a big problem, and they were unafraid of people because they lived on an island, and that made them very easy prey for sailors perishing for lack of fresh food. So you can see he has a very wry expression. I think there's only one dodo bird whole entire specimen in the world, and this is probably it, I would imagine. Well, so let's talk a little bit about the biology of the passenger pigeon, so you know what they are. You now know what they aren't. The first thing to know is that I couldn't figure out how to make this thing go backwards before. Now I can make it go forward. Okay, here we go. The first thing to know is that the passenger pigeon was incredibly numerous a very, very short time ago. The total number of birds has been estimated at 3 to 5 billion with a B, which is the same as the number of birds which overwinter, all the birds that overwinter in the United States right now. Some think that it might have comprised about up to 40% of North America's bird life. It existed in impossibly large flocks. One was estimated at 3,717,120,000 pigeons went over Fort Massasauga, Ontario in 1860. So the flock could have been 300 miles in length and the breadth of 1 mile. So these were just incredible. We can't even conceive of what this was like. Such large flocks conveyed what is known as predator saturation, because there's so many birds that predators can pick off a few, but they can't pick them all off. So populations were pretty stable, and mortality mostly occurred from late snowstorms, trampling by their own species. And of course, there were all kinds of predators like martins, minks, weasels, raccoon, bears, bobcats, mountain lions, you name it. If it was around, they would eat a passenger pigeon. But mostly, I'm sorry here, they didn't have many things that were just destroying their population. As you can see from this map many times, the passenger pigeons inhabited the eastern deciduous forest and a bit of the Great Plains. In the summer, they bred in the northern part of their range and overwintered in the southern part. The artist John James Audubon said a lone passenger pigeon streaking through the forest passes like a thought. Isn't that nice? It is estimated that they could fly up to 60 miles an hour, which is pretty speedy for a pigeon. Flocks in New England were caught with rice in their crops, gathered from southern states, so large distances could be covered very rapidly. So the statistics are amazing, and I should mention that you can go to your library and ask for interlibrary loan and get this book, which I'll put up in the references, that has more facts and figures than you can possibly imagine. This is the Joel Greenberg, A Feathered River Across the Sky. This is hot off the press in 2013. Now, what you might say, what did the song of the passenger pigeon sound like? Well, there is no answer. We listened. There were no organized scientific studies. There were people with sonograms recording things. There's a lot of written information, but it's all anecdotal. So we don't know what it sounded like, which is amazing when you think of the numbers of these things. Here is a description from 1850 by an Indian chief in Michigan that may give you some idea. One morning on leaving my wigwam, I was startled by hearing a gurgling, rumbling sound, as though an army of horses laden with sleigh bells was advancing through the deep forest toward me. Nearer and nearer came the strange commingling sounds of sleigh bells mixed with the rumbling of an approaching storm. So it must have been quite an event to see these pigeons coming. Okay, to feed such large numbers, the flocks flew from place to place, eating until the mast, i.e. the food, was cleaned out. Passenger pigeons ate apparently mostly acorns, beech nuts, and American chestnuts, which is also extinct by 1940, and a variety of other things taken as encountered. Seeds from pine, hemlock, juniper, elm, maple, ragweed, smartweed, partridgeberry, pokeberry, strawberry, grape, blah, 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 wild rice, and cultivated grains like corn, rye, and peas, which did not make them very popular with the farmers, as you could imagine. Various insects and snails. Feeding on the ground, the flock rolled over itself. And when you get that little picture of the passenger pigeon, you can see why this would be an apt description from somebody from 1905. If they were approaching, there would be the appearance of a blue wave 4 or 5 feet tall rolling over you. They're going like this. The back of the flock comes up to the front. When startled, their sudden flight would sound like rumbling thunder. So they must have been gorgeous. The sheer size of the flocks probably affected the deciduous forest itself. Some researchers think that passenger pigeons, because they could eat large fruits like acorns, helped with the northward spread of the oak trees out of the Ozark refugium during the glaciers, and when the glaciers melted, those oak trees had to get somehow north, and things like blue jays and passenger pigeons, which had big mouths, could bring them north. And if they got to a place that they wanted something else to eat, they could regurgitate everything that was in their crop, so I suppose that's kind of how the seeds got there. And also, they affected the composition of the eastern deciduous forest, of which we are members here. They did not eat white oak acorns, that group of plants. They ate the red oak acorns. So there used to be lots more white acorns in pure stands, and now that there are not any passenger pigeons, I don't see many white oaks around, but apparently the red-black group has gained dominance. So there are all kinds of situations that you wouldn't think that would happen that apparently occurred because the pigeon was there in large numbers. Okay, here's an egg. In Wisconsin, the nesting season occurred from March to May, depending on the weather. Most nests were found north of Kentucky. The average nesting site has been computed at 3 miles wide and 10 miles long. The parents produced a single egg, or rarely two, and were not thought to have a second brood. The egg was white, unmarked, 1 inch wide, and 1.5 inches long. The egg card below the egg was prepared with a scientific name in Greek, ectopistes, meaning moving about or wandering, and Latin, migratorius, meaning migrating. Okay. After courting, oops, back here. Well, who knows where I'm going here. I wanted to show you the bird on the nest. This is why you should never let me around any kind of machinery. Well, after courting, both parents made the nest and took turns incubating the egg for about 13 days. The nests were not very pretty, if you saw that brief thing up there, which I don't think I can get back to. They were very loosely made of twigs with no padding and low-hanging branches. Nests were very densely packed and practically touching each other. Roosting sites had broken tree branches, toppled small trees, and inches of pigeon coop accumulating beneath them. The aroma was evident for miles away. It smelled like a poultry farm. So you knew when the pigeons were around you. Well, I mentioned a while ago that one of the distinctive features about the columbiformes, the pigeons as a whole, is that they produce pigeon milk. And the crop is a little organ inside the throat that sloughs off cells and produces something that is very much like rabbit milk, apparently. It has water, proteins, and fat, but no sugar. Solid food softened in the parental crop would be introduced at some other point later on. And this is a rock dove, so you've got 2 pigeons in the nest, but I couldn't find anything, obviously, of a passenger pigeon. Feeding stopped at 14 days, after which the adults abandoned the chicks, which are called squabs. And this is what everybody wanted to eat because they're extremely fat, tasty, tender, and yummy. Although I'm just an ugly, ugly bird, don't you think? The parents abandoned the chick, and they fluttered around on the ground, which would have made them easy to get, and until they could fly away, and at that point they were lean and not so very tasty. So to summarize, the passenger pigeon depended on immense, low-flying flocks that continually moved across the ranges in search of food and nesting sites. A single egg in a flimsy nest produced 1 offspring per pair. These characteristics built up an enormous population well adapted to prehistoric conditions, but not very good when Europeans arrived. So let's talk a little bit about the history of passenger pigeons and people. Because the flocks moved irregularly, and for the most part unpredictably, they might not appear in one place between 7 and 8 years, depending on where the food was. So you couldn't tell when they were coming or where they were going to be. The Aboriginal peoples made little impression on the numbers of the birds. Many tribes rigorously enforced the taking of squabs, leaving the adults to breed. Those that were not eaten immediately were salted for later use or sometimes sold to Europeans. Feasts were matters of great celebration. Here's something from New York. Colonel Thomas Proctor in 1791 said about the feast. Some boiled, some stewed, and the mode of dishing them was that a hank of 6 were tied in a deer's sinews around their necks, their bills pointing outwards. They were plucked, but of pin feathers plenty remained. The inside was taken out, but it appeared from the soup made of them that the water had not touched them before. The repast being the best I had seen in a long time, I ate of it very heartily, and the entertainment was given with the appearance of much hospitality. So, we know about these uses because there are archaeological remains. Now, bird skeletons are very, very fragile. And so, in the southern part of their range, you don't find many birds. But in Meadowcroft, which is a site in Pennsylvania that's been inhabited, probably not continuously, but for 14,000 years, there are records of passenger pigeons being there. So they've been around a long time, and Indians have eaten these on a regular basis. You can see the very deep keel over there on the left for the attachment of the powerful flight muscles. But otherwise, a very fragile skeleton. When Europeans came to the East Coast, they were amazed at the bounteous flocks. Jacques Island in 1545 remarked about the infinite numbers of wood pigeons. Ville de Champagne noted in 1605 in Maine countless numbers of pigeons, and Sir John Smith in 1607 in Virginia finally spoke for himself, and when he noted the great plenty of swans, parrots, and pigeons. So here is early naturalist artist John James Audubon with a 1831 or so portrait of the passenger pigeon. The male is on the bottom. You can see the red breast and the beautiful blue back, and the female is on top. Audubon has often been criticized because his pictures are not exactly realistic. The female probably wouldn't be feeding the male, and they're always sort of in twisted spaces so that they will match the frame. But you get an idea of what they were like. Okay? Early writers took notice also. Anybody ever have to memorize Evangeline? In 6th grade, I had to learn about iambic pentameter, and this is the forest primeval. Well, I didn't come to the part that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow mentioned this part, but it's in there. It says, "Then it came to pass that a pestilence fell upon the city," this is Philadelphia, "presaged by wondrous signs, and mostly by flocks of wild pigeons, darkening the sun in their flight with naught in the craws but acorns." Okay. And there's at least one early musical reference for some person who I am not familiar with at all, named Anthony Philip Heinrich, wrote a symphonic poem called The Columbiad, or Migration of the American Wild Passenger Pigeons, around 1860. This is just to show you that they were a common part of people's lives back in the 1800s, although we have largely forgotten about them today. Okay? Well, in the early 1800s, hunting was a casual family affair that might be intense locally, but did not significantly change the size of the flocks, even with the Europeans. The flocks seemed endless. So here's an example from John Muir, our local boy from Montello, well known, about the great slaughter of passenger pigeons that occurred on his family farm. One of the children said, "It's awful like a sin to kill them." Muir goes on, "To this some smug practical old sinner would remark, 'Ah, it's a pity, as ye say, to kill the bonny things, but they were made to be killed and sent for us to eat as the quails were sent to God's chosen people when they were starving in the desert.'" So it was an interesting attitude that we share today, but that's what they thought. And the state of Ohio had an official proclamation in 1857 that said, "The passenger pigeon needs no protection, being wonderfully prolific, having the vast forests of the north as its breeding grounds. It is here today and elsewhere tomorrow, and no ordinary destruction can lessen them or be missed from the myriads that are yearly produced." Well, pride goeth before a fall, right? Two things happened that changed all this. And one of them is the extension of the railroads. starting about 1850. For example, railroads came to the Wisconsin Dells in 1857-58. So often there was refrigeration attached to these things, or some way of getting squabs quickly from one place to a faraway place before they spoiled. Okay? They could be salted, they could be frozen, they could be caught in the winter and sent frozen already. And the second thing was the addition of a telegraph line, so that people could be notified at a great distance, and then they would jump on a train if they knew where there was some nesting site, and they would rush to this place. And commercial hunting was exceedingly common from 1850 to about 1870 or so. And I will give you some numbers that are impossible to understand in a couple minutes, but here's the railroad. Now, Wisconsin plays an interesting role in this story. So here's about my third reference to Wisconsin, I think. The largest nesting site ever reported occurred in central Wisconsin, not far from where we are today. Observers estimated it covered 850 square miles and contained, let's see, 135 million birds. All right. Let's see, so I don't have my little pointer, but it's going from Grand Rapids, which is now Wisconsin Rapids, down to Kilbourne City, which is now Wisconsin Dells, and up to Sparta and Black River Falls over there, okay? So this is sort of wall to wall to wall to wall pigeon. And you can imagine that this was very, very heavily hunted. Passenger pigeons were supposedly exceedingly easy to capture. A single shot could bring down 30 or 40 birds. Now I'm going to read you what James Fenimore Cooper said in 1823, but you can think back to the Wisconsin thing, because this is all going on right here. The reports of the firearms became rapid, while volleys rising from the plain as flocks of more than ordinary numbers darted over the opening, shadowing the field like a cloud. And then the light smoke of a single piece would issue from among the leafless bushes on the mountain as death was hurled on the retreat of the affrighted birds, who were rising from the volley in a vain effort to escape. Arrows and missiles of every kind were in the midst of the flocks, and so numerous were the birds and so low did they take their flight that even long poles in the hands of those on the sides of the mountain were used to strike them to the earth. So prodigious was the number of birds that the scattering fire of the guns with the hurtling missiles and the cries of the boys had no other effect than to break off small flocks from the immense masses that continued to dart along the valley as if the whole feathered tribe were pouring through that one pass. None pretended to collect the game which lay scattered over the fields in such profusion as to cover the very ground of the fluttering victims. And sometimes they just collected them for hog feed and stuff. So, I mean, this was an endless resource, and it was being exploited. Well, keep this picture in mind, and there aren't many pictures of passenger pigeons. So if you look at any programs or read any books or go online, you will see this picture, sometimes colored. Okay, look at that, and look at this. This is a contemporary watercolor by Walton Ford, who has been described as Audubon on Viagra. And he has all kinds of environmentally caustic pictures. The one we have in Fayetteville and in Bentonville at Crystal Bridges is of Tasmanian wolves devouring themselves. And here you see passenger pigeons, clearly drawn to my eye at least from that previous print, committing suicide essentially. But we know that they did not commit suicide. We brought it upon them. But people still remember in some strange way. But it's a memory, it's not the real thing. So besides shooting and poles and all this kind of thing, there were a variety of large nets. Often stool pigeons, those captive birds with their eyes sewn shut and tethered to a stool under the net, were used to lure the flock down. Poisoned or alcohol-soaked grain provided added inducement for passing flocks. So you could get a zillion birds that way. And it was boundless and bounteous, and they went after them with a vengeance. The carnage was amazing. Now, I can't find anything of passenger pigeons, but it was the era of hunting and exploiting your environment. Okay? So, what you see on the bottom left-hand corner is sometimes mentioned as passenger pigeon skulls. I challenge you to say that rapidly. But in fact, the passenger pigeon skull would have to have been like that. These are bison or buffalo. So you can see that they're not passenger pigeons, and the bison did escape extinction, but they came pretty darn close to being totally wiped out, okay? And, well, anyhow. So let me just go back and review the history of the decline of these populations, because it's amazing in its rapidity and its irreversibility. In the pre-1800s, there were stable populations due to limited hunting. In the early 1800s, there was a slow decline due to habitat destruction, but from 1850 to 1880, commercial hunting just did them in. For example, in 1851 in Massachusetts, 4 commercial firms shipped 150,000 dozens, okay, calculate that out. That's 1,800,000 birds, and that's just in one state alone. And they were worth like pennies a piece on the market. I know you can't compare today's prices to what they were back then, but sometimes it didn't even pay you to ship these things because they were so plentiful. And another thing that I don't have pictures of, but which happened, was that people had trap shoots of live pigeons. And so that one trap shooting club for one event might go through 5,000 live pigeons. So if you read the Greenbird book, or another one by A.W. Shorter, who was a wildlife biologist at the University of Wisconsin, another reference to Wisconsin, in 1955, I mean, the statistics are just overpoweringly dreadful. I can't go on any more about them. Rewards were, well, let's see, okay. In 1890, the last pigeons were seen in the eastern states. In 1900, the last wild pigeon was seen in Ohio, and in 1914, Martha died in the Cincinnati Zoo. So it went from this it went into a downward spiral, for whatever reason you want to think, but they did not do well and they were gone. Rewards were offered, token legislation passed, but that was still the end of the passenger pigeon. Pigeons were reportedly, hopefully, surviving in Chile, Australia, Asia, Arizona, anywhere, but they didn't. They were gone. So think about that. Well, what were they doing with these pigeons? There are some sort of odd little pictures. The memory of the pigeon lives on in all kinds of common place names. And here is the state of Arkansas with a number of places that have pigeon names, so we'll skip that and look at Wisconsin instead. The USGS Geographic Names Information System lists 37 place names which have now, or once, included the word pigeon. Of course, some things have changed. Anybody here from Clintonville?
Pigeon River.
Okay, it used to be called Pigeon. Clintonville used to be called Pigeon, according to these folks, and I assume that they know what they're doing. And you can see that Waupaca County there had 5 different things, which is the Pigeon River, and they count things like the South Branch and the North Branch and the Middle Branch and everything, and Pigeon Lake. And you may know of more in Waupaca. Anybody? Well, there's lots of them. They're all over the state. Trempealeau County has 7. So it was a common kind of thing, and pigeons enter into our language. If you say pigeon, somebody is a pigeon, that probably isn't necessarily a flattering term, because it can be a dupe or a sucker. And also, it can be a good-looking girl or woman. I'm not going to touch that connection there. We talked about clay pigeons. There were stool pigeons, a pigeon pair. Now, I think this is referring to rock doves that have 2 eggs and are thought at one time, which is probably not true now, to have a boy and a girl. So if a human family has a pigeon pair, they have a boy and a girl. And of course, there's pigeonhole from the little pigeon coats that pigeons lived in. Okay. Well, Of course, the most common usage was as food. Remember the 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie? Europeans were accustomed, and apparently still do, I guess, eat small birds and frequently put them into pies. Still today, French Canadians make a spicy pie for the Christmas holidays called the courtière. This refers both to a pigeon pie and the pigeon itself, although there is considerable etymological discussion about which came first, the pie or the pigeon. Pies were often baked with the bird's feet sticking up in the center to ensure that the consumer knew the origin of the filling. And there are all kinds of recipes that you can find. And an 1871 recipe required 18 squabs. So that's a lot of birds for one pie. I don't know how to go back. No. Help me. Nobody can help me. Well, yeah, there was. Okay, get me back 2 pictures, and I'll just tell you how a bird caught. Go back. Go back. There. Oh, you're a genius. What did you do? Don't go away. Okay. Well, we'll see what we can do here. Okay, this is how a pigeon that is caught in Sparta, Wisconsin, would end up at a fancy banquet in Delmonico's in New York. Okay? There would be after the pigeon was captured, an 8-mile wagon ride from the nesting area to Sparta. The squab would be packed in ice and shipped on the 3 p.m. express train to Milwaukee and then Chicago, and then another express train to New York City. Then the driver for the American Merchants Union Express would take the barrel of pigeons to the game dealer, something like Fulton's Market. And then Lorenzo Delmonico himself would stroll in and pick out the freshest barrels of pigeons. And so by that evening, it would end up on the table for Admiral Campion. So the trains, of course, are contributing to this tremendously. Pigeon fat was also used for shortening and for soap making, and feathers went into beds and pillows. Okay. For the first time in the Victorian era, the middle class had both time, money, and leisure to collect, and collect they did. Now this happy little couple, the male and the female there, would not have probably ended the passenger pigeon's life as a species, but there were lots of these around, apparently. So this is what you'd have for a decoration in your living room, perhaps. They should have had a bell jar over it to keep the domestic beetles out, or they would have been eaten in the flesh, but perhaps they had enough arsenic in the preparations, which they often did in old-time hole mounts like this, that the beetles were not affecting them. Well, let's see, the next one. Oh, here's another kind of collection that I didn't know anything about at all. I mean, there's so many funny things you learn when you're reading about these things. I didn't stop to think that binoculars were not common for ordinary people until about the 1900s. You had a little monocular if you're a sea captain or something, but if you're John Doe walking around, you didn't have them. So if you wanted to study a bird, you had to either shoot it like Audubon did, for which he gets a lot of bad press, of course, but that was the only way he could see them up close. Or later on, they had things like these things, which are cigarette cards. And apparently, I don't know about this, when cigarettes first came out, the cigarette packs were very flimsy, and so to make them stiffen, they put a little piece of cardboard with a picture of a pretty woman or some military stuff or birds or something, and then people would, in each pack, to keep the pack in shape, and so you would try to collect all the different things in the set, and thereby smoke an awful lot of cigarettes. So this probably did more harm to the people than it did to the passenger pigeons. You can see the passenger pigeons down there in that bottom row there. But I'm sure if you had this set today, it would be worth a lot of money. Now, something that might have done more harm was the collection of the eggs themselves. Many a farm boy became a collector of bird eggs. These often poorly school-trained but observant naturalists knew when a bird would nest, where it would nest, and when to harvest the eggs before the chick developed, so the egg could be blown, drill a little hole in it, and then they'd blow out of one hole. I have no idea how you do this. The contents, so you just have the eggshell, and they would label them up, and then they would trade them all over the world. I have eggs that have gone through 8 or 10 different trades in my collection. And it's quite fascinating. And they were collected. They were just traded all over the world, and if you had a rare set, you were wonderful, and if you wanted to make a rare set, you could fake it very often. So there are lots of really sort of strange distribution records these days because certain collectors were known to do this because there was money involved, okay? So these were traded all over, and they're really interesting to study. I have like 6,000 sets in my collection that we have dealt with. Something else that you don't think about now, or I don't think about now, is that there weren't commercial egg growers back then. So if you were a railroad or a hotel or something like that, you had to get lots of eggs. And there were professional egg collectors who went out and went to rookeries and got, for example, shorebird eggs were wonderful things to collect. And that, of course, had more effect, sort of the commercial collecting of eggs had a bad effect on one thing or the other, different species of birds. If you know of any orphan sets of eggs like these, tell some museum, because they are wonderful. They are just wonderful. They tell so many wonderful stories. And here you would go to the Richter Museum of Natural History at UW Green Bay, which has an excellent collection of eggs. Just gorgeous. Or if you're in Arkansas, you can tell me, I'll take them. But when I was a graduate student at Madison, we had DDT hearings in the 1960s. Anybody remember those? Okay. Remember that DDT was sprayed all over because it was a very effective insecticide. And then, of course, Rachel Carson and others came along and showed all the fact that DDT builds up in the fat of predators and so forth. And so if you're a peregrine falcon or a brown pelican or a bald eagle and you're laying eggs and you sit on the eggs, the eggshells that were affected by DDT had very thin shells and you ended up with scrambled eggs. And so some of my professors were involved, I think, with the Environmental Defense Fund, and held hearings in which they effectively showed that by studying the thicknesses of eggshells in museum collections like this, before DDT usage and after DDT usage, that the DDT was affecting this. And there are all kinds of chemical analysis and structural analysis and things. But there are uses for these collections that you can't possibly think when they're first made. I mean, these guys were just collecting them because they were pretty. But there is real use comes out of these things. Okay, so I don't want to exempt the ladies here. This is about the turn of the century, and it shows the fashion affected by trendy ladies, where they have this exaggerated posture. Now, ladies, shield the husband's eyes, because we're going to show underwear here. Ready? Okay, this is a pigeon breast blouse. That's what they were called. I suppose this is mimicking a pouter pigeon. And you can see that this was achieved by this horribly cruel corset that people wore underneath, which looks like it would do a good deal more damage to the people than it would to the pigeon. And I've seen people, x-rays of skeletons of ladies who are achieving this 14-inch waist or whatever they were going after, and their ribs are just all squished. It's horrible. Okay, so now I'm going the other way. Help! I'm just pushing the left side. Oh, for pity's sakes, well. Okay, so now what do I do?
Go next.
I don't know how to
Bring the
go next.
cursor up to next.
Use the scroll.
Scroll up to next. There you go. There.
And now I click left or right, do you think?
Just click next.
Left.
Well, how odd. So much for whatever. Okay, well, here is a picture that is in Crystal Ridges, which is a lovely new museum built by Walmart money down in Arkansas that y'all have to come and visit. So here's something that does a great deal more damage. In the 1880s, hats were a veritable zoo of birds, nests, small mammals, and other creatures. Frank Chapman documented the following menagerie on the hats of Manhattan ladies walking by his office in 1886. Check this out. He identified the wings, heads, tails, or entire bodies of 3 bluebirds, 2 red-headed woodpeckers, 9 Baltimore orioles, 5 blue jays, 21 common terns, a saw-whet owl, and a prairie hen. In 2 afternoon trips, he counted 174 birds and 40 species in all. I mean, if that's not a passenger pigeon, it's close enough for this talk, don't you think? And of course, things like this led to the development of legislation, which is a whole other story, which I'm not going to go into, but still. Okay, there, that's where we want to be. Well, you've all heard the old phrase that extinction is forever. Well, there are some new phrases, of course. Well, extinction is a fact of life, and here's some of the things that are threatened or endangered. And you can recognize many of them. What is alarming today is the rate of extinction, the number of organisms per unit time that are disappearing. This is a global phenomenon as illustrated by the large birds and mammals in this poster. It has recently been estimated as of July 25th in Science that among the terrestrial vertebrates, 322 species have become extinct since 1500, and population of the remaining species show 25% average declines in abundances. This is not good, folks. This trend is particularly noticeable in the large animals, the pandas, wolves, caribou, sea turtles, whales, penguins, marsupials, gorillas, rhinos, blah, 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 but also carries on into the invertebrates. Think of the monarch butterfly. We are destroying our world, essentially. So, now Audubon again, he has such lovely pictures, you can hardly resist them, managed just purely accidentally to get 2 species here that are today extinct. This is the shrub Franklinia. It's in the tea family. It's related to a camellia, and it lived on the bend of one river in Georgia. And by 1803, folks like John Bartram and all those little horticulturalists in Philadelphia and so forth had collected this thing. So there were no living shrubs. You can buy it today. You can go to White Flower Farm and pay a lot of money, but it's apparently kind of hard to grow. But you can get this shrub. But in the wild, it does not exist because people collected it. The Bachman's warbler, which you see, which is what Audubon was after, was last spotted in 1961 and is probably extinct in the wild due to habitat destruction in southeastern nesting grounds, rice and soybeans, which are big Arkansas crops, and the Cuban wintering grounds where you have sugarcane. Closer to home, let's see, in Wisconsin there are 5 mammals, 24 birds, 1 amphibian, 7 reptiles, 20 fish, 23 insects, 4 snails, 19 mussels, and 130 plants listed as endangered or threatened. So right here in our own backyard, we've got plenty of things that could need some help and caring. Here are 6 species that I picked out because they were pretty. And pretty things always get more attention, you know. There's the piping plover, emerald butterfly, ugly little but very important freshwater mussel up there, a little small little fish that's brilliant in breeding condition, ornate box turtle, and a monkson. So maybe you've seen these, maybe you haven't. But chances are, in 20 years, you're not going to be seeing them at all. And here are some Arkansas ones that are slightly different. The one that is most interesting to us is the American burying beetle down in the bottom. And that, the adults lay their eggs in small dead animals. And then they bury the thing, and the eggs hatch out and eat up whatever they were supposed to be buried with, and so forth. So it's kind of a neat little system. And of course, with the decrease in passenger pigeons, which are small dead animals, these populations have plummeted. Now, you really can't prove, I suppose, that it's directly related, but it certainly was a coincidental decline. Well, let's go back to Audubon one more time, just because he has such pretty things. And talk a little bit about Arkansas. Arkansas has had 2 large showy birds which have disappeared relatively recently. On the right-hand side, you see the Carolina parakeet. And I bet you didn't know that that bird actually lived in Wisconsin. It's the farthest northern parakeet, just in the bottom southwest of Wisconsin. But it's on the map and it's on all the range things. So it counts. And these would be pretty nifty to see, wouldn't they? Although it'd be probably a huge agricultural pest, but pretty nifty birds anyhow. And they were in southern New England and eastern Colorado. The last known specimen also died at the Cincinnati Zoo in 1918 and was sent in a block of ice to the Smithsonian, but was lost in transit. Deforestation and hunting did it in with the possibility of introduced poultry diseases. If I say that in Arkansas, I'll be killed because we grow a lot of Tyson's chickens down there and a lot of poultry diseases. On the left-hand side, we have the Ivorybilled Woodpecker. And in 2004, the Ivorybilled Woodpecker, which was thought to be extinct, was spotted in a swamp forest southeast of Little Rock. And I got phone calls from people just all over as soon as that was announced. An intensive search by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology resulted in a publication in Science, which is a very reputable journal, a couple of years later saying they probably had them. They had sonograms and so forth, and they put out all kinds of cameras, and they looked all over and over and over. But there have been no further sightings, and interest in the ornithological community has waned. Perhaps they're in Florida or Louisiana, but wherever they are, they're very rare and very threatened. And they were huge. They were, well, here, let's go to the next one. The pileated woodpecker, which you have here, is a big, impressive bird, right? But the ivory-billed was even bigger. It was 26 to 30 inches long from head to tail and had a wingspan of just slightly less than a meter. So when people saw these things, they'd say, oh my God, and it's called the Lord God bird. There are all kinds of books about this. And the people by Little Rock thought they saw one of these and have a picture, which may or may not be definitive evidence, but it would be nice to have a bird in the hand. Although Doug James, our ornithologist, thinks that the recordings are sufficient. But who knows? If it isn't extinct, it's well on its way, and it needs help. And they have set aside land down there, and they're trying to stop the siphoning off of water, but who knows? Well, okay, back to the de-extinction part of this. If it isn't extinct, there are some people who think that they can do something to bring back the passenger pigeons, just like Jurassic Park, right? That was a whatever. Well, you can't bring dinosaurs back because the DNA is too fragmented to do anything. But apparently, by doing back crosses with related animals, you might be able to get something that sort of approximated a passenger pigeon. And some people thought that the mourning dove would be the good thing to do. It's a native bird. It occurs in the pass range of the passenger pigeon, but it flies high. It doesn't associate in large flocks. It eats smaller seeds, and DNA says it isn't related, so can't use that. So anyhow, passenger or mourning doves are all over everywhere. The candidate for doing this is the Bandtailed Pigeon, which is slightly larger. And if you'd seen the picture of the passenger pigeon to begin with, you would have seen that they look kind of like each other. And this is sort of the Western counterpart, I suppose. It's longer, sleeker, Western in distribution, and a rapid flyer. So, passenger pigeon was in the eastern part of the United States, and this is in the western part of the state. The organization that wants to do this is something called Revive and Restore, and this is from their webpage. It is a gorgeous poster picture of something like a Flemish painting, where if you click on each one of these numbers, you will get the name of the animal that is extinct. And you can see the Carolina parakeet up there and the passenger pigeon up at the apex, and honestly I don't know what the rest of them are, although I looked some of them up. But it's just a gorgeous picture, and they have a very fascinating website that I suggest that you look at. And there's a recent article in Audubon magazine about this too that's very interesting. And what they want to do, now I'm not a DNA expert, so I don't know. I will just read this to you, and you can just say that you've heard it. Number one, Genetic samples are taken from stuffed museum passenger pigeons. They include DNA fragments that can be sequenced, that can figure out what's in them. The passenger pigeon genome in number 2 is compared with that of its close relative, the bandtailed pigeon. Scientists identify genes that are specific to the passenger pigeon, such as those that create its red-brown tail feathers or long tail. Number 3, these DNA segments specific to passenger pigeons are then introduced into the genome of the bandtailed pigeon, replacing the corresponding DNA sequences. Scientists grow primordial germ cells that contain the synthetic genotype of passenger pigeons. Number 4. Doesn't sound like something you do in an afternoon, does it? Primordial germ cells are then introduced into a pigeon egg. Chicks that hatch carry passenger pigeon germ cells in their sperm or ova. They grow normally, mate, and lay eggs. Passenger pigeons hatch out of these eggs, and then they're trained to follow rock doves that are painted to look like passenger pigeons to wherever they migrate back and forth. Well, okay, so maybe. A little philosophical thought here from one of our basic philosophers, who at one point said, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And that is true. The question is de-extincting the passenger pigeon what we want to do? Well, there's another fascinating article that was in the New York Times magazine a while ago, and I have some references if anybody wants to look this up, that express these basic objections to this idea of de-extinction. You don't know that the animal wouldn't go extinct again, because you don't know really why it went extinct, because there weren't any decent studies done of this. I mean, it certainly was over 100, but you know, I mean, there were an awful lot of them to begin with. Stanley A. Temple, who was a retired wildlife ecologist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, says there would be enough massed food in the deciduous forest to support these things. So they could eat, but maybe something else would get them. Maybe there would be a disease. There are all kinds of diseases around now because of the introduced chicken farms and stuff, and they might not be able to cope with it. It's a very expensive proposition, and it would take money away from all kinds of recovering plans for things like the Ivorybilled Woodpecker and so forth. But it's already here. You don't have to start it from nothing. And David Simberlow, who is a very well-known senior ecologist, was just practically frothing at his mouth, and I will read what he had to say. Techno fixes for environmental problems are band-aids for massive hemorrhages. To the extent that the public thinks that we can just go and resurrect a species is extremely dangerous. De-extinction suggests that we can techno-fix our way out of environmental issues generally, and that's very, very bad. In other words, I guess he's saying that we should try to keep what we've got and not waste our money on doing all these other things. Well, you have to decide what species you want to say. They're after mastodons and things like that, and the dodo bird. So who gets your money? There are all kinds of animal cruelty issues, and then of course the legal one for you lawyers in the crowd. Would these animals be protected by the Endangered Species Act? Would they be regulated as a genetically modified organism? I'm sure we'll have a response to that. Can they be patented? And finally, it is not the original animal. It's a bandtailed pigeon with passenger pigeon genes introduced into it. And since we don't really know the exact behavior of the passenger pigeon to begin with, because nobody made any scientific studies, how do we know we're getting it back? So, anyhow. Now, two other things I found out when I was looking around. This guy is Charles Otis Whitman, and he was a zoologist at the University of Chicago, and he tried to breed passenger pigeons at the end of their life cycle around 1900. And some of them did, and some of them didn't, but they didn't do very well, and he couldn't really get a viable flock. So maybe you need millions and millions of other birds around to make this whole thing work. I mean, there are all kinds of unknowns. So he tried and he couldn't do it. He did give Martha probably to the Cincinnati Zoo, maybe. And we have to think about climate change, which is surely occurring. And here is somebody's idea of what happens to the beech trees. Remember, they ate beech seeds. Currently, and 100 years from now, Okay, so the composition of the eastern deciduous forest is going to change. Each species of tree is going to have its own response to these things, these changes. And so they will end up in Canada, and maybe the passenger pigeons would end up there, but the soils that you find in the eastern seaboard region are not the really heavily glaciated, thin soils that you find up there, so although climatically this tree could grow, maybe it couldn't grow because the soils are wrong. So, you know, you just don't know. Well, I hate talks that tell you all the gloom and doom, of which there's plenty in this, I'm sure. But there are some things that you might do. And the first thing you should do is to look at this Project Passenger Pigeon site, which is a consortium of 160 different organizations that are devoted to spreading information about Martha. And they have lesson plans for teachers and origami things and the story of the passenger pigeon and photographs and things that you can do and use, and a speakers bureau, which I am not one of them. I'm sure they'd have somebody who knew how to work the PowerPoint thing better than I did. But it's just a ton of information on this site. So if anybody's intrigued by what little I have said, use this site and get some more information, okay? I would suggest that you support legislation to protect endangered and threatened species. Protect the organizations, the museums, the zoos, and the universities which work very hard to support endangered and threatened species. You can go to Baraboo in Wisconsin and visit the Aldo Leopold Foundation. Aldo Leopold is, well, what should we say? Sort of the patron saint.
Yes.
Yes, and I'm sure that, how many people have read Stan County Almanac? Okay, well then you know what I'm talking about. And you can go and see his place, and you can see the International Crane Foundation, which is there, where they're trying to maintain the cranes. And when I was a kid, you didn't see sandhill cranes walking around in the field. Now you can hardly walk around and just be trampled by them and everything. So it's nice to see this, right? There are museums. If you go out to Washington, D.C., once there were billions vanished birds of North America. We'll be there from June 2014 to October 2015, and I'm sure it's a bang-up exhibit. There will be a television program of this same title, and I have been unable to find out exactly when it's coming up, but I'd be very surprised if Nova or Nature or something like that did not have. Does anybody know about this? Anybody seen it? I have not seen it, but they have put together this thing. They've been requesting funds, so apparently none of us gave enough money to give it some publicity. But you can go and see that. You can go to your local museum. Go down to Madison and see the Chazen Museum of Art. It used to be Elvium. And this guy, Tom Utek, is a Wisconsin artist, so you ought to be aware of his work. And this picture would be about the size of this wall. And he's got something like 230 species of birds in there, if you saw it up close. It's quite fascinating. And there's a little black bear in the front, and it's looking at a black bear on the other side of the lake, which you probably can't see. But there's pictures that you want to stop and think and look at, I think. And when I see this, I see that he's got all kinds of birds in the sky that are kind of painted over, so you can just see a shadow. And to me, this is his remembrance of the passenger pigeon. But he's very elusive, and I can't get the guy on the phone, although I have tried several times. But you want to keep Martha and her ilk in your memories, because if something is forgotten, it's gone forever. Well, we have reviewed the biology, history of interactions with people, effects of overhunting, and possible attempts to de-extinct the passenger pigeon. I ask you to remember Martha and honor her memory by seeing that other plants and animals do not meet the same fate. And I will close with the words of Aldo Leopold from the Sand County Almanac in 1949. So this is a tad ago, but what he said is still true. Men still live who in their youth remember pigeons. Trees still live who in their youth were shaken by a living wind. But a decade hence, only the oldest oaks will remember, and at long last, only the hills will know. There will always be pigeons in books and museums, but these are effigies and images, dead birds which cannot dive out of a cloud to make the deer run for cover, or clap their wings in thunderous applause of mast-laden woods. Book pigeons cannot breakfast on new-mown wheat in Minnesota and dine on blueberries in Canada. They know no urge of seasons, they feel no kiss of sun, no lash of wind and weather. They live forever by not living at all. So make Martha live.
Questions?
Yes, ma'am.
This is not a question, but I thought you would like to know that you have shared the podium that Stanley Temple and Tom Utek have.
Oh, really?
They have both been speakers of this organization.
Okay, okay. Well, he came down, Utek spoke at Crystal Bridges, and I heard him there. He was quite fascinating. So you're familiar with all his pictures then? He didn't say anything about passenger pigeons, I suppose.
No, not.
Well, he should have. Then, when you see a picture, it's up to you to interpret it your way, and that's the way I do it. Questions? I've stunned you. Yes, sir.
I sense you're not very optimistic about the future regarding endangered species. Is that because there are those who try to gut the Endangered Species Act? It's not a political issue for most people. The human population keeps growing. I mean, that's the message I get. You're not too optimistic.
I think that climate change is going to do us in. It's going to do all kinds of things that people cannot predict at this moment. And the future of many of those large animals that I showed you on that poster are really, is not very good. It takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of luck. So it would be my humble opinion that we ought to work very hard to keep the things that we have right now. And I'm really sorry about Martha, but you know, if you looked out your window and saw a couple billion birds coming your way and there was 10 inches of pigeon poop in your yard, I mean, people just wouldn't like that, would they? I mean, I wouldn't like it, and I would like to see Martha, and maybe you couldn't get a viable bunch of passenger pigeons unless you had a huge number of them or something. So I think it all depends on people who care and people who work for their local organizations. So the lady that you had that talked about the river earlier this summer was fighting to save that little river. I forget which one it was here. Was it not the Waupaca River? Where? And things like that take a lot of effort and a lot of dedication, and I'm sure that many of you here have done that kind of thing. So I say keep on and keep doing it. Anything else? Yes?
You mentioned them collecting the eggs, but were the eggs were also used for consumption?
Oh yeah. Before there were commercial places that grew eggs, I can't think of the island that's off of San Francisco where all the shorebirds nest. Well, I don't know, whatever it was. But there were a lot of shorebirds, and shorebird eggs are easy to collect, and they're big, and they used to go out there to feed the hotels and all the miners and stuff in San Francisco, and they did very bad. I can't remember what it is. It's a channel island, but there's a definite name of it. But if you get a book called Ralph's Talking Eggs, anybody read that? Well, let's see. I can't think of what Ralph's last name was, but he was a little farmer in Iowa, and he lived a long time ago, like the 1920s or something, where it was legal to collect eggs, and these guys would go out, and they knew their bird biology, and they knew where the eggs were, and they would collect the eggs, and they would be carefully label them up and make nice little labels that give you all kinds of interesting information. And he put them in those little drawers like I showed you, and took good care of them, and he died, and I think maybe his sons or his grandsons inherited the farm. And they came across these things in the attic. And they didn't know what to do with them. Well, there were 6,000 sets of eggs. A set is what one bird would lay at one time, okay? And they're distinctive to that species of bird. And they're a record in time because they carry chemical information with them and all kinds of things that we probably don't appreciate right now. And so eventually he ended up giving, the relatives ended giving these 6,000 sets along with the documentation to Yale University, which I bet was just so happy to get these things. I mean, I got some from a little guy down by Little Rock who went around and collected eggs, and he made this little cabinet, and he had it all handmade and took care of them, and then the eggs got all messed up and everything, so you had to spend hours and hours and hours straightening them out. But they're a wonderful record. You can't go back in time. You don't have a time machine to see what things were like. But collections like that will do it for you. So there's this wonderful little book called Ralph's Talking Eggs that you can probably get from your library that shows the trading cards that they had for the birds and everything, and talks about all the different species. And the people that collected eggs back in the day were just crazy. I mean, they climbed up cliffs and fell off to their deaths and faked eggs. And I'll tell you one story and then I'll quit. But there was a fellow who eventually grew up to be the ornithologist at the Smithsonian, and he was down in Arizona when it was still a territory, and he was collecting hawk eggs. And I think this is what Victorian guys did to get away from the ladies so they could spit in a ditch and do things on their own. And so he's riding his horse with his other army guy, and they're out getting these hawk eggs, and he climbs up the cliff and he gets the zone-tailed hawk or whatever it was. And he's riding back, and I think it was Apaches or something, or some Comanches or some group did not care to have him out there, and they started firing at him. And so there's this great chase back to the fort, and he puts the egg in his mouth to save it. And he gets back there, and of course his mouth is frozen shut like this, and he can't talk, and so he has his underlings take the butts of their rifle and knock out his teeth to get the egg. Okay, well, you know, I think that this is all totally apocryphal, but in fact, it wasn't, because it was in the congressional record. And he grew up to be the ornithologist at the Smithsonian, and you can go online and you can see sets of that particular species that were found at the Smithsonian during the place that he was. So, and he was a very well-respected ornithologist. So I don't know. So they were just all just crazy about this stuff. So they had a great passion. So I'm asking you to all have a great passion for the things that you can do and save these things and keep them alive. So thank you very much for